the most questionable prophecies in the Bible, the biblical lies they taught us. Throughout history, people have looked to ancient texts for guidance, wisdom, and glimpses into the future. The Bible stands as one of the most influential books ever written, with billions of believers worldwide pointing to its prophecies as undeniable proof of divine inspiration. But what happens when we actually examine these predictions under the harsh light of historical evidence and logical scrutiny? Today, we're diving deep into something most religious leaders would rather you not think about too carefully. We're going to dissect the most questionable prophecies in the Bible, the ones that don't just fall short of their promises, but collapse entirely when confronted with reality. This isn't about attacking faith or believers. It's about asking honest questions that deserve honest answers. For too long, these failed predictions have been swept under the rug, reinterpreted beyond recognition, or pushed into some distant future where they can never be properly tested. But the time has come to pull back the curtain and examine what these prophecies actually say versus what actually happened in the real world. What you're about to discover might shock you. Some of the Bible's most celebrated prophecies aren't just wrong, they're spectacularly, almost comically wrong. And yet, for centuries, religious institutions have built entire doctrines around these failed predictions, asking people to have faith in words that history has already proven false. Let's start with perhaps the most significant failed prophecy in all of Christian theology, one that cuts to the very heart of the religion itself. According to the New Testament, Jesus Christ made a very specific, very clear promise to his followers about when he would return to earth. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus tells his disciples that some of them standing right there would still be alive when he returned in glory. He didn't say maybe. He didn't speak in riddles. He made a direct statement about timing. Some of his listeners, he claimed, would witness the end of the world with their own eyes before they died. Think about that for a moment. This wasn't a vague prediction about the distant future. This was Jesus telling people in his immediate audience that they would personally see his triumphant return. These were real people with real names, real families, real lives stretching ahead of them. So what happened? Well, those disciples lived their lives, grew old, and died. All of them. Every single person who heard those words passed away, waiting for a return that never came. We're now 2,000 years removed from that promise, and not only has Jesus not returned, but every generation since has been told the same thing. He's coming back soon, just wait a little longer. This is what failed prophecy looks like in its purest form, a specific prediction with a clear time frame that simply didn't happen. If any other person in history had made such a bold claim and been proven wrong, we would dismiss them as a false prophet or a deluded individual. But somehow, when it comes to Jesus, believers have spent 2 millennia explaining away this failure rather than acknowledging it. The mental gymnastics required to defend this failed prophecy are truly impressive. Some claim that generation doesn't mean what it obviously means. Others suggest that Jesus was speaking spiritually rather than literally, despite the concrete language used. Still others push the entire prophecy into the future, claiming it will happen someday, even though Jesus specifically said it would happen before his listeners died. This pattern of failed prophecy, followed by creative reinterpretation, isn't isolated to Jesus' return. It's woven throughout biblical predictions like a thread of disappointment that believers refuse to acknowledge. Take the Old Testament prophecy about the ancient city of Tyre. The prophet Ezekiel made incredibly specific predictions about this Phoenician city's destruction. According to Ezekiel, Tyre would be completely destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, scraped clean like a bare rock, and never rebuilt. Fishermen would spread their nets where the city once stood, and it would remain desolate forever. This sounds impressively detailed, doesn't it? Ezekiel even named the specific king who would accomplish this destruction. Surely such precision indicates divine foresight. But history tells us a very different story, one that makes this prophecy not just wrong, but embarrassingly so. Nebuchadnezzar did indeed attack Tyre, just as Ezekiel predicted. But here's where the prophecy falls apart. He didn't destroy it. Despite a siege that lasted over a decade, Tyre survived. The city continued to function, trade, and prosper long after Ezekiel's predicted destruction date had passed. Later, Alexander the Great did manage to conquer Tyre through an ingenious military strategy, but even then, the city wasn't permanently destroyed. It was rebuilt and continued to exist. In fact, Tyre still exists today in modern Lebanon. You can book a flight there right now, walk its streets, eat in its restaurants, and meet people who call it home. The prophecy said Tyre would never be rebuilt, that it would remain a bare rock where fishermen spread their nets. Yet there it stands, a living, breathing city that has existed continuously for thousands of years. This isn't a case of misinterpretation or symbolic language. This is a straightforward prediction that history has definitively disproven, but the failures don't stop there. Ezekiel also made bold predictions about Egypt that are equally laughable when compared to historical reality. According to this prophet, Egypt would become a desolate wasteland, completely uninhabited for 40 years. He claimed that the Egyptian people would be scattered among the nations and that Egypt would never again rule over other peoples. Once again, history provides a clear verdict on these predictions. Egypt was never abandoned for 40 years. There's no historical evidence of the Egyptian population disappearing or the land becoming uninhabited. Egyptians continued to live in their homeland, farming the Nile Delta, conducting trade, and maintaining their civilization. As for never ruling over other nations, Egypt continued to exert influence and control over various regions even after Ezekiel's time. The idea that Egypt would become permanently powerless was simply wrong, contradicted by centuries of subsequent history. These aren't minor details that can be explained away through creative interpretation. These are fundamental factual errors in what are supposed to be divinely inspired predictions of the future. The pattern becomes even more disturbing when we examine the Book of Revelation, Christianity's primary source for end times prophecy. This bizarre text, filled with dragons, beasts, and cosmic catastrophes, has been used for nearly 2,000 years to predict the imminent end of the world. Medieval Christians were convinced that Revelation described their era, pointing to plagues, wars, and social upheaval as signs of the approaching apocalypse. During the Black Death, many believed they were witnessing the final judgment. In the 1800s, preacher William Miller calculated that Jesus would return in 1844, leading to what became known as the Great Disappointment, when nothing happened. Modern televangelists and prophecy enthusiasts continue this tradition, constantly finding new ways to apply Revelation's imagery to current events. Every major crisis, every war, every natural disaster becomes another sign that the end is near. Yet despite thousands of confident predictions based on Revelation's prophecies, not a single one has ever come to pass. The problem with Revelation isn't just that its predictions have failed repeatedly. The problem is that its language is so vague and symbolic that it can be twisted to mean almost anything. This isn't prophecy. It's a Rorschach test where people see whatever they want to see. A genuine prophecy should be specific, testable reality. Revelation offers and clearly fulfilled in observable none of these qualities. Instead, it provides endless opportunities for reinterpretation whenever its supposed predictions fail to materialize. Perhaps even more troubling are the prophecies that sound impressive until you realize they were written after the events they supposedly predict. The Book of Daniel provides a perfect example of this deception. The text describes the rise and fall of various empires with remarkable accuracy, leading many to marvel at its prophetic precision. but scholars have demonstrated that Daniel wasn't written during the Babylonian exile as it claims. Instead, it was composed much later, during the Greek period, after the events it supposedly predicts had already occurred. This isn't prophecy, it's history disguised as prediction. It's like someone today writing that World War II would happen and then claiming to have made that prediction decades earlier. Anyone can predict the past with perfect accuracy. The challenge of true prophecy lies in predicting the future, and that's precisely where biblical prophecy consistently fails. The manipulation becomes even more apparent when we examine what are arguably the most foundational prophecies in Christianity, those supposedly fulfilled by Jesus himself. For centuries, believers have pointed to Old Testament predictions about the coming Messiah as irrefutable proof that Jesus was the chosen one. But when we peel back the layers of translation, interpretation, and historical revisionism, a very different picture emerges. Let's start with the famous virgin birth prophecy. Christians love to point to Isaiah's words as clear evidence that the Messiah would be born of a virgin, and therefore Jesus' miraculous conception was foretold centuries in advance. There's just one massive problem with this claim. It's based on a translation error that completely changes the meaning of the original text. The Hebrew word used in Isaiah doesn't mean virgin at all. It means young woman. This wasn't some subtle linguistic nuance that got lost over time. This was a deliberate mistranslation when the Hebrew scriptures were rendered into Greek. Somewhere along the way, a young woman became a virgin, and an entire doctrine was built on that error. Think about the implications of this. One of Christianity's most cherished beliefs, the virgin birth, rests on a mistranslation. If you remove this translation error, the entire prophecy crumbles. Yet millions of believers have built their faith around what amounts to an ancient clerical mistake. The Bethlehem prophecy presents another fascinating case study in how supposed fulfillments fall apart under scrutiny. According to Christian teaching, the Messiah had to be born in Bethlehem to fulfill Old Testament prophecy, and conveniently, that's exactly where Jesus was born. Problem solved, right? Not quite. The Gospel writers themselves seem confused about this detail. Matthew tells one story about how Jesus ended up being born in Bethlehem, while Luke provides a completely different explanation involving a census. These accounts don't just differ in minor details, they contradict each other fundamentally. More importantly, historians widely agree that Jesus was most likely born in Nazareth, not Bethlehem. The Bethlehem birth stories appear to be later additions, crafted specifically to make Jesus fit the prophetic requirements. This isn't prophecy being fulfilled. This is a story being retrofitted to match ancient predictions. It's like claiming there was an ancient prophecy that a great leader would be born in a specific city, and then, centuries later, writing biographies that place your chosen leader's birth in that exact location, even when historical evidence suggests otherwise. That's not fulfillment of prophecy. That's creative writing designed to support a predetermined conclusion. But the problems with messianic prophecies go much deeper than translation errors and geographical disputes. Many of the so-called predictions that Jesus supposedly fulfilled weren't even considered messianic prophecies by the Jewish scholars who wrote and preserved these texts. Take the famous suffering servant passages that Christians claim describe Jesus' crucifixion in vivid detail. To Christian eyes, these texts seem to perfectly describe Jesus' sacrifice. But Jewish interpretation, both ancient and modern, understands these passages as referring to the nation of Israel itself, not an individual Messiah. This represents a fundamental misunderstanding or deliberate misrepresentation of Jewish scripture. The Christian interpretation requires reading these texts completely out of their original context and imposing meanings that the original authors never intended. When we examine other supposedly fulfilled prophecies, the same pattern emerges repeatedly. Vague or symbolic language gets interpreted in ways that support Christian theology, regardless of what the original authors actually meant or what the historical context suggests. Consider the prophecies about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. Jesus allegedly predicted that the temple would be destroyed and not one stone would be left upon another. Christians point to the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE as clear fulfillment of this prophecy. But here's the catch. Scholars widely believe that the gospel accounts containing these predictions were written after the destruction had already occurred. Once again, we're looking at history being rewritten as prophecy, not genuine prediction of future events. This pattern of post-facto prophecy writing appears throughout the New Testament. The Gospel writers had the advantage of hindsight, knowing exactly what had happened to Jerusalem, to the Jewish people, and to the early Christian movement. They could craft their narratives to make it appear that Jesus had predicted all of these events with supernatural foresight. The prophecies about the end times present perhaps the most embarrassing failures in all of biblical prediction. Jesus didn't just hint that the world might end someday. He gave specific, unmistakable signs that would precede his return. He spoke of stars falling from the sky, the sun being darkened, and the powers of heaven being shaken. To modern ears, these might sound like poetic descriptions of cosmic events, but we now understand that stars are massive nuclear furnaces located light years away from Earth. The idea that they would fall to our planet reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of basic astronomy. These predictions reflect the ancient worldview where stars were thought to be small lights attached to a solid dome above the Earth. They're not prophecies, they're ancient misconceptions about the nature of the universe dressed up as divine revelation. The cosmic signs that Jesus described would supposedly accompany his return within that generation. Not only did these astronomical impossibilities fail to occur, but Jesus himself failed to return as promised. Yet somehow, believers continue to read these passages as if they contain meaningful predictions about the future. Perhaps most telling is how biblical prophecy handles specific, testable claims versus vague, unfalsifiable ones. The prophecies that can be clearly tested against historical evidence, like the destruction of Tyre, the desolation of Egypt, or the timing of Jesus' return, fail spectacularly. Meanwhile, the prophecies that remain popular are those so vague they can be interpreted to mean almost anything. Take the famous prophecy about the desert blooming when God's people return to their land. Modern believers point to Israel's agricultural achievements as clear fulfillment of ancient prediction. But this completely ignores the role of modern irrigation technology, scientific farming methods, and decades of hard work by real people using real engineering solutions. To claim that drip irrigation systems and desalination plants represent the fulfillment of ancient prophecy is to rob human achievement of its credit while attributing scientific progress to supernatural intervention. The desert blooms today not because of prophecy, but because of human ingenuity and determination. This brings us to one of the most troubling aspects of biblical prophecy: its complete failure to predict any genuinely useful information about the future. If these texts were truly inspired by an all-knowing deity, wouldn't we expect them to contain some knowledge that ancient people couldn't have possessed on their own? Instead, we find predictions that reflect the limited understanding of their time period. We see geographical errors, astronomical misconceptions, and historical inaccuracies that any truly divine source should have been able to avoid. The prophecies tell us nothing about disease, nothing about natural disasters that could have been prevented, nothing about technological developments that would transform human life. They offer no insights that would have helped ancient peoples avoid suffering or improve their condition. What they do offer is exactly what we'd expect from human authors trying to make sense of their world: hope for their enemies' defeat, promises of their own restoration, and vague assurances that justice would eventually prevail. This pattern of failed prophecy reveals something deeply uncomfortable about how religious institutions have handled these texts over the centuries. Rather than honestly acknowledging when predictions don't materialize, there's been a systematic effort to reframe, reinterpret, and relocate these prophecies to avoid the obvious conclusion that they were simply wrong. The mental contortions required to defend these failed predictions would be impressive if they weren't so tragic. When Tyre wasn't destroyed as predicted, suddenly the prophecy was about a different destruction, or a spiritual destruction, or a destruction that would happen eventually in God's own timing. When Jesus didn't return within that generation, suddenly generation meant something completely different, or the prophecy was spiritual rather than literal, or it would happen in the far future when we least expect it. This isn't honest scholarship, it's damage control. And the damage being controlled isn't just to the prophecies themselves, but to the entire framework of biblical authority that depends on these predictions being accurate. Consider what happens when we apply this same flexible interpretation standard to any other area of life. If a weather forecaster predicted that it would definitely rain tomorrow, and then it didn't rain for the next 50 years, would we keep trusting their predictions? Would we say that tomorrow actually meant something symbolic, or that the rain was spiritual rain, or that it would definitely happen someday in the future? Of course not. We'd recognize that the forecaster was wrong and find someone more reliable. Yet when it comes to biblical prophecy, believers have spent 2 millennia making excuses for predictions that would be laughed out of any other context. The prophecy about Damascus provides another perfect example of this phenomenon. Isaiah declared that Damascus would cease to be a city and become a heap of ruins. This wasn't poetry or metaphor. It was a clear prediction about the fate of a specific city. Damascus happens to be one of the oldest, continuously inhabited cities in human history. People have lived there for over 4,000 years, and they're still living there today. It's currently the capital of Syria, home to millions of people, complete with universities, hospitals, businesses, and all the infrastructure of a modern city. The prophecy said Damascus would cease to be a city. Yet there it stands, as much a functioning city today as it was when Isaiah made his prediction. This isn't a case where we need to dig through archaeological evidence or debate historical interpretations. You can literally visit Damascus right now and see for yourself that the prophecy failed. But here's what's truly remarkable. Despite this obvious failure, believers continue to insist that the prophecy will somehow be fulfilled. Some claim it's still coming in the future. Others argue that Damascus has been spiritually destroyed even though it physically thrives. Still others suggest that the prophecy was fulfilled in some ancient battle that history failed to record properly. These aren't serious attempts to understand the text. These are desperate attempts to avoid acknowledging that the text is wrong. The same pattern emerges with Ezekiel's prophecy about Egypt being uninhabited for 40 years. When we examine the historical record, there's simply no evidence that Egypt was ever abandoned. Egyptian civilization continued unbroken through the periods when this desolation was supposed to occur. Farmers kept farming, traders kept trading, builders kept building. Yet rather than admit this prophecy failed, defenders create elaborate explanations. Maybe the 40 years were symbolic. Maybe the desolation was spiritual rather than physical. Maybe it happened, but historians missed it. Maybe it's still going to happen in the future. At what point does the evidence become overwhelming enough to simply say that the prophecy was wrong? How many failed predictions does it take before we stop making excuses and start acknowledging reality? The book of Revelation presents perhaps the most extreme example of this interpretive flexibility. For nearly 2,000 years, people have been absolutely convinced that they were living in the end times described by John's apocalyptic visions. Every generation has found ways to map current events onto Revelation's symbolic language. Medieval Christians saw the Black Death and concluded that the end was near. Reformation-era believers identified the Pope as the Antichrist and expected Jesus to return momentarily. American preachers in the 1800s calculated exact dates for the Second Coming. Modern evangelicals point to everything from nuclear weapons to computer technology to global pandemics as signs of the approaching apocalypse. The remarkable thing about Revelation isn't that its predictions have failed. It's that they failed so consistently and repeatedly that the failures themselves have become part of the tradition. Each generation of believers manages to convince themselves that previous generations simply misunderstood the timing, but that they've finally cracked the code. This isn't prophecy. It's a perpetual motion machine of false hope. The text is so vague and symbolic that it can be endlessly reinterpreted to fit whatever crisis or concern happens to be dominating the headlines at any given moment. Think about what real prophecy would look like. If an all-knowing deity wanted to demonstrate supernatural foresight, wouldn't the predictions be unmistakably accurate? Wouldn't they contain information that ancient people couldn't have known? Wouldn't they be specific enough to be clearly tested and verified? Instead, we get predictions that reflect the limited knowledge and worldview of their historical period. We see geographical errors that any divine source should have avoided. We find astronomical misconceptions that reveal ignorance about the basic structure of the universe. We encounter historical inaccuracies that no omniscient being would have made. The prophecies about Jerusalem's destruction illustrate this perfectly. Christians love to point out that Jesus predicted the temple would be destroyed, and indeed it was destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE. This seems impressive until you realize that the gospel accounts containing these predictions were almost certainly written after the destruction had already occurred. This is prophecy by hindsight, authors writing after the fact and attributing their knowledge to earlier predictions. It's no more impressive than me writing today that the Titanic will sink and then claiming I made that prediction a century ago. But even if we accepted these as genuine pre-destruction predictions, they tell us nothing that any informed observer of the time couldn't have anticipated. The political situation in first century Palestine was incredibly volatile. Roman-Jewish tensions were escalating. Revolts were brewing. Any reasonably intelligent person could have predicted that conflict was coming. Real prophecy would have provided specific details that no human could have known in advance. It would have named the Roman general who would lead the siege. It would have given the exact date of the destruction. It would have described the specific military tactics that would be employed. It would have predicted the precise consequences for the Jewish people in the centuries that followed. Instead, we get vague warnings about destruction that could have applied to any number of potential conflicts. This isn't supernatural foresight. It's educated guessing dressed up as divine revelation. The prophecies about the Messiah reveal another layer of this problem. Christians claim that Jesus fulfilled dozens of Old Testament predictions, proving his divine identity. But when we examine these supposed fulfillments closely, we find the same pattern of post-facto interpretation and creative reframing. Many of these messianic prophecies weren't originally understood as referring to the Messiah at all. Jewish scholars, both ancient and modern, interpret passages like the suffering servant as referring to the nation of Israel, not to an individual savior figure. The Christian interpretation requires reading these texts completely out of their original context. It's like taking a love poem written about someone's hometown and claiming it was really a prophecy about a specific person who would be born centuries later. You can make the interpretation work if you ignore the original context and impose your own meaning, but that doesn't make it legitimate. Other supposed messianic prophecies were simply misunderstood or mistranslated. The virgin birth prophecy, as we discussed earlier, is based on a translation error that changed young woman into virgin. The Bethlehem birth prophecy may not have been about the Messiah's birthplace at all, but rather about a future leader who would emerge from the Bethlehem region. When we strip away the mistranslations, the out-of-context interpretations, and the after-the-fact story construction, what remains of these messianic prophecies? Very little that couldn't be attributed to coincidence, creative interpretation, or deliberate narrative construction by the gospel writers. The failure of biblical prophecy becomes even more apparent when we consider what these texts don't predict. If they were truly inspired by an all-knowing deity, wouldn't we expect them to contain some knowledge that ancient people couldn't have possessed? Where are the prophecies about the new world that would be discovered across the ocean? Where are the predictions about the diseases that would devastate populations? Where are the warnings about natural disasters that could have been avoided with advanced knowledge? Where are the technological prophecies that would demonstrate genuine supernatural foresight? Why didn't the Bible predict electricity, or medicine, or flight, or any of the other developments that would transform human civilization? Instead, we get prophecies that reflect the concerns, knowledge, and worldview of ancient Middle Eastern peoples. We see predictions about local political conflicts, regional powers, and tribal concerns. We find prophecies that make sense within their historical context, but offer no insights that transcend their time period. This is exactly what we'd expect if these prophecies were human productions rather than divine revelations. Ancient authors wrote about what they knew, hoped for what they wanted, and predicted what seemed likely based on their limited understanding of the world. The cosmic prophecies present perhaps the most embarrassing failures of all. Jesus spoke of stars falling from the sky as if they were small lights that could drop to earth. He described the sun being darkened and the moon not giving its light as if these were simple mechanical processes that could be easily interrupted. We now know that stars are massive nuclear furnaces located unimaginable distances from Earth. The idea that they would fall to our planet reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of basic astronomy. These aren't prophetic insights, they're ancient misconceptions about the nature of the universe. The same applies to other cosmic predictions throughout biblical prophecy. The description of the sky rolling up like a scroll reflects the ancient belief that the heavens were a solid dome that could be physically manipulated. The imagery of celestial bodies falling to Earth makes sense only if you believe that stars and planets are small objects suspended close to the Earth's surface. These prophecies don't reveal divine knowledge about the future. They reveal human ignorance about the present. They show us exactly what we'd expect from ancient authors working with the limited scientific understanding of their time. Perhaps most troubling of all is how these failed prophecies have been used throughout history to justify terrible actions and policies. The belief that biblical prophecy predicted the restoration of Israel has influenced Middle Eastern politics for over a century. The conviction that the end times are approaching has shaped environmental policy, foreign relations, and social legislation. When people believe that God has already determined the course of history, they become less motivated to work for positive change and more willing to accept or even accelerate negative developments. If prophecy says the world is going to end soon anyway, why worry about climate change or nuclear proliferation? These aren't abstract theological questions. They have real-world consequences that affect millions of people. Failed prophecy isn't just an embarrassment for religious institutions. It's a source of misguided policies and dangerous decisions. The time has come to acknowledge what the evidence clearly shows. Biblical prophecy is not what its defenders claim it to be. These aren't divine insights into the future. They're human attempts to understand and influence their present circumstances. They reflect the hopes, fears, and limited knowledge of their authors, not the omniscient perspective of a supernatural deity. This doesn't mean these texts have no value. They offer fascinating insights into ancient cultures, belief systems, and worldviews. They contain wisdom about human nature, ethical principles, and the search for meaning. They've inspired great art, literature, and social movements throughout history. But they are not accurate predictions of future events. They do not provide reliable guidance for understanding current affairs. And they certainly don't prove the existence of supernatural forces or divine intervention in human history. In recognizing the failure of biblical prophecy isn't an attack on faith or spirituality. It's simply an honest acknowledgement of what the evidence shows. And perhaps, in the long run, this honesty will lead to more mature, thoughtful approaches to these ancient texts that don't require us to deny obvious realities or perform intellectual gymnastics to defend the indefensible. The prophecies have spoken, history has answered, and the verdict is clear for anyone willing to see it. But there's another layer to this deception that runs even deeper than failed predictions and mistranslations. Some of the most celebrated prophecies in the Bible aren't just wrong. They're deliberately constructed to appear more impressive than they actually are. Let's examine how ancient authors used a technique that modern scholars call vaticinium ex eventu, prophecy after the event, the book of Daniel's sleight of hand. For centuries, believers have marveled at Daniel's incredibly provides the perfect case study for this literary detailed predictions about the rise and fall of successive empires. The text describes the Babylonian Empire giving way to the Persians, follow their characteristics, conflicts, and ultimate fate. At first glance, this seems like genuine supernatural foresight, howled by the Greeks, with remarkable precision about could someone living during the Babylonian period have known such specific details about empires that wouldn't emerge for generations? The answer is simple. They couldn't have, because they didn't. Careful analysis of Daniel's language, historical references, and theological concepts reveals that the book was actually composed much later than it claims. The prophecies about earlier empires were written after those events had already occurred. The authors had the benefit of hindsight, allowing them to craft detailed predictions about events that were already historical fact by the time of writing. It's like someone today writing a detailed prophecy about World War II, including specific battles, key figures, and strategic turning points, then claiming it was written in 1900. The accuracy would seem miraculous until you realize the deception involved. This technique wasn't uncommon in ancient literature. Authors frequently attributed their works to earlier, more prestigious figures to give them greater authority. But when modern believers point to Daniel's prophetic accuracy as evidence of divine inspiration, they're unknowingly celebrating historical fraud. The same pattern appears in other supposedly prophetic texts. Predictions that seem remarkably accurate usually turn out to have been written after the events they describe. Meanwhile, genuine predictions about future events, those written before the events occurred, consistently fail to materialize. Consider the elaborate prophecies about the end times scattered throughout the New Testament. These texts describe cosmic catastrophes, supernatural interventions, and the complete transformation of reality as we know it. They promise that these events will occur within the lifetime of the original readers. Paul explicitly tells the Thessalonians that they will personally witness these events, using language like "we who are still alive" to include himself in the group that would see the end. He wasn't speaking metaphorically about distant future generations. He genuinely believed he would live to see the apocalypse. That was nearly 2,000 years ago. Paul died. The Thessalonians died. Their children died. And their children's children died. Generation after generation has passed away waiting for events that never came. Yet somehow, modern texts' original meaning and purpose. These weren't Tim believers continue to read these passages as if they were written for today's audience. This represents a fundamental misunderstanding of Thelis' predictions about the distant future. They were urgent warnings about immediate expectations. When those expectations failed to materialize, later generations had to choose between abandoning the predictions or reinterpreting them beyond recognition. The choice was clear. Rather than admit the prophecies had failed, religious authorities began the long process of explaining them away. Soon, every failed prediction became a spiritual truth. Every missed deadline became a test of faith. Every obvious error became a mystery too deep for human understanding. But perhaps nowhere is this pattern more obvious than in the prophecy industry that has grown up around modern Israel. For over a century, Christian prophecy enthusiasts have pointed to the establishment and success of the modern Israeli state as clear fulfillment of biblical prediction. The argument seems compelling at first. Ancient texts spoke of the Jewish people returning to their homeland, the desert blooming like a rose, and Jerusalem being restored. When Israel was founded in 1948 and began transforming arid land into productive agriculture, Believers saw their prophecies coming to life before their eyes. There's just one problem with this interpretation. It completely ignores the human agency, technological innovation, and political maneuvering that actually made these developments possible. The desert didn't bloom because of ancient prophecy. It bloomed because of modern irrigation systems, scientific farming methods, and decades of backbreaking labor by real people using real engineering solutions. To claim that drip irrigation technology represents the fulfillment of biblical prophecy is to rob human achievement of its credit while attributing scientific progress to supernatural intervention. It's like saying that ancient prophecies predicted flight, then pointing to the Wright brothers' airplane as proof, while ignoring the years of experimentation, engineering, and innovation that made flight possible. This tendency to retrofit modern achievements onto ancient predictions reveals something troubling about how prophecy functions in religious thinking. Instead of acknowledging human accomplishment, believers feel compelled to find prophetic explanations for every positive development, as if admitting human capability would somehow diminish divine glory. The prophecy about nations streaming to Jerusalem provides another example of this retrofitting process. Isaiah describes a future time when all nations would come to Jerusalem to learn God's ways and receive instruction. Modern believers point to tourism, international conferences, and diplomatic visits to Israel as clear fulfillment of this ancient prediction. But this interpretation requires ignoring the obvious differences between ancient expectations and modern realities. Isaiah wasn't predicting tourism or business conferences. He was describing a time when Jerusalem would become the UND political center of the entire disputed religious and world, when all nations would abandon their own beliefs and submit to Jewish law. That hasn't happened. Jerusalem remains one disputed city among many, respected by some religions and ignored by others. Most of the world's population has never heard of these prophecies, much less arranged their lives around them. International visitors come to Jerusalem for the same reasons they visit any historic city: cultural interest, political necessity, or commercial opportunity. To claim this represents prophetic fulfillment requires such a dramatic reinterpretation of the original text that the prophecy becomes meaningless. If any amount of international attention counts as all nations streaming to Jerusalem, then the prophecy is so vague it could be fulfilled by virtually any city at any time in history. This pattern of vague reinterpretation appears throughout modern prophecy interpretation. Specific predictions get watered down into general trends. Clear timeframes get expanded into unlimited future possibilities. Concrete expectations get spiritualized into metaphorical meanings. The result is a system where prophecy can never truly fail because it can always be reinterpreted. When specific predictions don't materialize, they become spiritual truths. When clear timeframes pass without fulfillment, they become tests of faith. When obvious contradictions emerge, they become mysteries beyond human comprehension. This isn't prophecy. It's intellectual dishonesty disguised as religious devotion. The prophecies about the restoration of the temple present another fascinating case study in creative reinterpretation. Multiple Old Testament texts describe a future temple that would surpass Solomon's original in glory and importance. Some passages provide detailed architectural specifications, measurements, and ceremonial procedures for this restored temple. Jewish exile communities clung to these prophecies during their centuries of displacement, seeing them as promises of eventual return and restoration. When they did return from Babylon and rebuilt the temple, however, the new structure was modest compared to the prophetic descriptions. It lacked the glory, the supernatural manifestations, and the international recognition that the prophecies had promised. Rather than acknowledge that the prophecies had fallen short, religious leaders began reinterpreting them. Maybe the true fulfillment was still in the future. Maybe the descriptions were spiritual rather than physical. Maybe human sinfulness prevented the full realization of divine promises. When the Romans destroyed this second temple in 70 CE, the reinterpretation process accelerated. Now the prophecies were definitely about a future spiritual temple, or they were about the temple of the human heart, or they were about the church as the new temple of God's presence. Each reinterpretation moved further from the original meaning of the texts, but it allowed believers to maintain faith in prophetic accuracy despite obvious failure. The prophecies hadn't been wrong. They had just been misunderstood, or their fulfillment was more complex than originally thought. Modern Christian dispensationalism has taken this reinterpretation to its logical extreme. According to this system, many Old Testament prophecies about Israel were suspended when the Jewish people rejected Jesus as Messiah. These prophecies will supposedly be fulfilled during a future tribulation period when God turns his attention back to the Jewish people. This theological framework allows believers to acknowledge that many prophecies haven't been fulfilled while maintaining that they will be someday. It's a clever solution to the problem of failed prophecy, but it requires assuming that God operates according to complex dispensational timetables that are never clearly explained in the biblical texts themselves. The prophecies about the ingathering of the exiles illustrate how this system works in practice. Multiple texts promise that God will gather the Jewish people from all nations and restore them to their homeland. Dispensationalists point to modern Israel as partial fulfillment of these prophecies, while acknowledging that many Jews still live in other countries. The solution is to claim that the prophecies are being fulfilled gradually, and that complete fulfillment awaits a future period when all Jews worldwide will return to Israel. This allows believers to see prophetic fulfillment in current events, while explaining away the obvious incompleteness of that fulfillment. But this interpretation faces several serious problems. First, many Jewish people have no desire to live in Israel and consider their current countries to be their true homes. The prophecies seem to assume that all Jews would eagerly return when given the opportunity, but modern reality shows this assumption was incorrect. Second, the prophecies typically describe the ingathering as a single dramatic event, orchestrated directly by God, not a gradual process spread over decades through human political and economic factors. The modern return to Israel looks nothing like the supernatural restoration described in biblical texts. Third, these prophecies usually include cosmic signs, supernatural interventions, and universal recognition of God's power that simply haven't occurred. If you remove these elements from the prophecies, you're left with vague predictions about population movements that could apply to numerous historical situations. The prophecy about the valley of dry bones in Ezekiel provides a perfect example of this problem. The text describes a vision where scattered bones come together, grow flesh, and return to life as a mighty army. This is presented as a metaphor for the restoration of Israel after exile. Modern believers love to apply this prophecy to the establishment of modern Israel, seeing the Holocaust as the valley of dry bones and Israeli independence as the resurrection. It's a powerful metaphor that resonates emotionally with many people. But the original prophecy wasn't about events that would occur over 2 millennia after it was written. It was about the immediate restoration of the Jewish people after the Babylonian exile. That restoration occurred within a few generations of Ezekiel's time, when the Persians allowed exiled Jews to return and rebuild Jerusalem. To apply this prophecy to modern Israel requires ignoring its original historical context and imposing a completely different time frame and set of circumstances. It's like taking a poem about recovering from a specific illness and claiming it prophetically describes a different person's recovery from a different illness centuries later. This tendency to constantly reapply ancient prophecies to contemporary events creates an endless cycle of false expectations. Every generation of believers becomes convinced that they are witnessing the fulfillment of biblical prophecy, only to see their specific interpretations proven wrong by subsequent events. The prophecies about Damascus provide another example of how this cycle perpetuates itself. Isaiah's prediction that Damascus would cease to be a city and become a heap of ruins has been applied to numerous conflicts throughout history. Medieval commentators saw it being fulfilled in various battles and conquests. Modern prophecy teachers have applied it to recent Middle Eastern conflicts. Each generation was certain they were witnessing the prophetic destruction of Damascus, yet the city continued to exist and function. Rather than acknowledging that the prophecy had simply failed, new interpreters emerged to claim that the real fulfillment was still coming. This pattern reveals something troubling about how prophecy functions in religious communities. Instead of serving as a test of divine inspiration, failed prophecies become opportunities for creative reinterpretation that actually strengthen faith by making believers feel they're part of an unfolding divine plan. The psychological appeal is understandable. People want to believe that history has meaning, that their struggles serve a purpose, that justice will ultimately prevail. Prophecy offers the comforting illusion that someone is in control, that events are unfolding according to a predetermined plan, and that faithful believers will ultimately be vindicated. But this comfort comes at a terrible cost: the sacrifice of intellectual honesty and critical thinking. When prophecy becomes unfalsifiable through endless reinterpretation, it ceases to provide any meaningful information about reality. It becomes a closed system that can accommodate any outcome while never admitting error. The prophecies about the conversion of the nations illustrate this problem perfectly. Multiple biblical texts describe a future time when all peoples will abandon their false gods and worship the God of Israel. These prophecies typically include specific details about foreign nations bringing tribute to Jerusalem, learning Jewish law, and participating in temple worship. After 2 millennia, this universal conversion obviously hasn't occurred. The majority of the world's population follows other religions or no religion at all. Most people have never heard of these prophecies, much less arrange their lives around them. Rather than acknowledging this obvious failure, believers have developed elaborate explanations. Maybe the conversion is happening gradually through Christian missions. Maybe it will occur during the millennium after Jesus returns. Maybe it's being fulfilled spiritually as people around the world develop personal relationships with God. Each explanation moves further from the original meaning of the prophecies, but it allows believers to maintain faith in their eventual fulfillment. The prophecies haven't failed. They're just being fulfilled in unexpected ways that require spiritual discernment to recognize. This kind of reasoning can justify virtually any interpretation of any text. If prophecy can be fulfilled gradually, spiritually, or in ways that completely contradict the original expectations, then the concept of prophetic failure becomes meaningless. Every prediction becomes true by definition, regardless of what actually happens in the real world. The prophecies about the restoration of the Davidic kingdom present similar interpretive challenges. Multiple texts promise that God will restore the throne of David and establish an eternal kingdom ruled by David's descendants. These prophecies include specific details about the extent of this kingdom, the nature of its rule, and the peace and prosperity it will bring. Jewish believers during the intertestamental period eagerly awaited this restoration, especially during times of foreign occupation and oppression. The prophecies sustained their hope and shaped their expectations about the coming Messiah, who would surely re-establish David's throne and drive out their enemies. When Jesus appeared claiming to be the Messiah but was crucified instead of establishing an earthly kingdom, his followers faced a crisis of interpretation. The prophecies seemed to demand a successful political revolution, but their Messiah had been executed as a criminal. The solution was to spiritualize the kingdom prophecies. Jesus hadn't failed to establish David's kingdom. He had established it in a different way than expected. The kingdom was spiritual rather than political, present rather than future, invisible rather than obvious. This reinterpretation allowed early Christians to maintain faith in Jesus as Messiah while explaining away the apparent failure of kingdom prophecies. But it required completely abandoning the original meaning of the texts, which clearly described earthly, political, visible restoration. Modern dispensationalists have added another layer to this interpretation by claiming that Jesus will literally fulfill these prophecies when he returns to earth. During the millennium, they argue, he will sit on David's throne in Jerusalem and rule the world with perfect justice. This interpretation attempts to preserve the literal meaning of the prophecies while explaining their apparent delay, but it requires assuming a complex theological timetable that includes two separate comings of the Messiah, a parenthetical church age and a future tribulation period, none of which are clearly explained in the original prophetic texts. The prophecies themselves show no awareness of such complicated timing. They present the Messiah's arrival and the establishment of his kingdom as a single unified event that would resolve Israel's immediate problems. To divide this into multiple stages, separated by thousands of years, requires reading later theological developments back into the original texts. Perhaps most tellingly, none of these interpretive strategies can explain why an all-knowing God would inspire prophecies that would be so consistently misunderstood by their original audiences. If the prophecies were meant to be fulfilled spiritually, why were they written in language that clearly suggested physical, political fulfillment? If they were meant for a distant future audience, why were they presented as addressing immediate concerns? The obvious answer is that these prophecies meant exactly what they appeared to mean to their original audiences. They were human attempts to encourage hope during difficult circumstances, to assert that justice would ultimately prevail, and to maintain faith in divine purposes, despite apparent evidence to the contrary. They weren't supernatural predictions of distant future events. They were very human responses to very human problems. And like most human predictions about the future, they were largely wrong. This doesn't make them worthless. They offer valuable insights into the hopes, fears, and worldview of ancient peoples. They demonstrate the universal human need for meaning and purpose in the face of suffering and injustice. They show how communities maintain identity and cohesion during times of crisis. But they are not evidence of divine inspiration or supernatural foresight. They are human documents that reflect the limitations and perspectives of their time and place. Recognizing this doesn't diminish their historical or cultural value, but it does require abandoning claims about their prophetic accuracy. The time has come to stop making excuses for failed prophecies and start appreciating these texts for what they actually are. Remarkable examples of human creativity, hope, and resilience in the face of uncertainty. That's a much more honest foundation for understanding their continuing relevance than pretending they accurately predicted events that clearly contradict their original expectations. When we finally acknowledge the obvious, that biblical prophecy is human rather than divine, we open the door to more mature, thoughtful engagement with these ancient texts. We can appreciate their literary artistry without defending their factual accuracy. We can learn from their ethical insights without accepting their cosmological assumptions. We can be inspired by their vision of justice without expecting their specific predictions to materialize. Most importantly, we can stop wasting intellectual energy on elaborate interpretive schemes designed to defend the indefensible and start focusing on the real challenges facing humanity today. Instead of scanning headlines for signs of prophetic fulfillment, we can work to address actual problems using actual knowledge and actual solutions. The prophecies have had their day in court. The evidence has been presented. The verdict is clear for anyone willing to examine it honestly. These texts are not what their most ardent defenders claim them to be, and continuing to pretend otherwise serves no one's interests, except those who profit from perpetuating the illusion. It's time to move beyond the failed prophecies of the past and focus on building a better future based on reason, evidence, and human compassion. That's a prophecy we can actually fulfill. So where does this leave us? We've taken a journey through some of the most celebrated prophecies in biblical literature, and what we've discovered isn't pretty. From Jesus promising his immediate return to his disciples who died waiting, to Ezekiel's failed predictions about Tyre and Egypt, to the endless cycle of reinterpretations surrounding Revelation, the pattern is unmistakable. These aren't divine insights into the future. They're human documents that reflect the hopes, fears, and limited understanding of ancient peoples. When we strip away the apologetics, the creative reinterpretations, and the desperate attempts to make square pegs fit into round holes, we're left with a simple truth. Biblical prophecy fails when tested against historical reality. This doesn't make these texts worthless, but it does require us to be honest about what they actually are. They offer fascinating glimpses into ancient cultures and belief systems. They demonstrate humanity's eternal search for meaning and justice. But they are not supernatural predictions, and pretending they are only perpetuates intellectual dishonesty. The next time someone tells you that biblical prophecy proves divine inspiration, remember Tyre still standing, Damascus still thriving, and Jesus still absent after 2,000 years of any day now. Remember that real prophecy should be specific, testable, and clearly fulfilled, not endlessly reinterpreted to avoid obvious failure. Perhaps it's time we stopped scanning ancient texts for glimpses of the future and started focusing on the very real challenges facing humanity today. That's a prophecy we can actually work together to fulfill.